Labor require projects in the Beetaloo Basin to buy carbon credits?
I answered in Alice Springs, and I think Mr Bowen has been up this morning, and I haven't seen the transcript in relation to that. We've already responded to that, and I've responded on Beetaloo. No, well, the answer is that no coal project will face a carbon constraint that is beyond, that will make them internationally uncompetitive. You know, we have always said we will ensure that whether it's coal mines or other facilities, they will remain internationally competitive. Hang on.
On the Port of Darwin, it's over there in the distance behind us. Yes. Mr Gosling just before framed it as an issue of sovereignty with the ball dropped on Mr Morrison's watch.
And he was right.
Given that that's how you're framing it, what will be your approach in government? Will you break that lease if it's a question of sovereignty, and will you buy it back?
We remain deeply concerned about the Port of Darwin, and I'm concerned at the fact that when I asked questions about this in estimates, it appeared that Defence had finished their review, but there were other parts of government that were part of that review, and it still was not made public. So it's been on review for, I've lost count. Brendan might be able to remember. I think it was his Defence estimates pack I was doing, actually. So. Pardon me, but we will look at that in government. Anthony Albanese is on the record as expressing concern about this at the time of the lease.
Senator Wong, just on the diplomacy, what will be your first steps if you win government as Foreign Minister to rebuild those relationships? And also the Prime Minister last week said that Australia should not be stomping around the Pacific telling people what to do. Does this approach run risk of that?
Honestly, some of the things he says, I don't know where to start. Okay. I think what Mr Morrison is doing with the second part of your quote is, again, refusing to take responsibility. Now, we recognise, as I said in my opening, this is a time where we live in a period of risk and uncertainty and of competition. So we have to leverage our strengths, and one of those is our engagement. So if Mr Morrison wants to dismiss engagement by leader or by Foreign Minister, well, he can explain why that was in the interests of the country.
On the specific Labor scheme, the AWU has raised some really significant concerns about that, about modern slavery and so on. So when you're talking about the uncapping...
And they're legitimate, and the Senate inquiry, I think, went to many of the really worrying examples of that. But Pat can respond if you want him to on some of the enforcement issues.
Thank you for that, Sarah. And look, absolutely, what we've seen is abuse of all the temporary migration schemes. One of the challenges is they've got differing levels of protection in them. And we've heard feedback from employers that the Pacific Labor ones generally have a bit better protection than the other schemes, and therefore the scrupulous employers have been undercutting using Pacific Labor by using the other schemes, and that's why we've been so focused on lifting the standard of all the schemes. In terms of the announcement today, we have announced increased compliance activity. That's really important. They include putting a firewall between the Department of Home Affairs and the Fair Work Ombudsman so that temporary migrant workers don't risk their visa by calling attention to abuses. Another example we've highlighted today is that we'll work with state and territory governments and local governments around one of the most notorious abuses, which is not so much being abused at work, but a worker then being packed in 14 or 15 to a 4-bedroom home and paying enormous rents that wipe away their salary. So we're going to be working with all levels of government on that. So you're absolutely right. We need to increase the standards, because not only is it obviously a huge impact on those workers and those families, the misery that this exploitation causes, it causes a bad name for Australia overseas. These abusers then get relayed back to the homes of these workers, and then their fellow citizens don't come to this country. So it's really important that we lift the standards of these schemes. They are good schemes. Most farmers, for example, do the right thing and they value the labour. We're going to partner with them to make sure that we have the best possible standards so that they work in the long-term interest of the farmers, the workers and the Australian national interest.
Hold on, Mr. Farrow, do you regret your comments in the 9 newspapers that not a single Australian coal mine will be impacted by our safeguard mechanisms? Do you regret your comments to the 9 newspapers and the confusion that has caused?
I don't regret it one iota, because it's true, and you just have to look at our policy. We've been very clear on our policy from day one when it was released in early December. Fact one, We are not expanding the number of facilities covered by the safeguards mechanism. It's around 250 facilities, including about 60 coal mines. That's fact one. Fact two, the policy very clearly stated that when the Clean Energy Regulator looked at the trajectories for each of the facility, they would take into account two factors. One, the available technology and emerging technology to allow that facility to reduce its emissions, and very importantly, the comparative constraint that their international competitors face. So that, as Penny said in her earlier answer, the coal mining industry will not suffer a disadvantage or a negative impact compared to their international competitors, and that's further confirmed by our independent and comprehensive economic modelling that made it very clear, that found that not a single coal mine would close early because of our policy, and not a single coal mining job would be lost because of our policy. If I can finish the question and the answer, this is really important. If you want to talk about divisions in climate policy, we've got a spectacular example happening right today between the Deputy Prime Minister backing his candidate in Flint, saying that their net zero emissions commitment by 2050 is optional, that there's wiggle room, that it's not binding, whereas we've got the members for North Sydney and Wentworth saying it's absolutely binding. I haven't seen a bigger split on climate change since Malcolm Turnbull was Prime Minister. So people should really be focusing on that. And secondly, this scare campaign by the National Party on coal is an absolute disgrace. When we get people like Productivity Commission economists like Matt Canavan from the Gold Coast, who smears coal dust on his face to go down a coal mine, just shows his disrespect for coal miners. If they were serious about supporting coal miners, they would support Labor's same job, same pay policy that actually attacks the scourge of casualisation and labour hire that's undermining conditions right now. Instead of doing that, they do a dirty deal with One Nation to pass legislation that cuts coal miners' wages and conditions. So that's a really important point.
There's no coal mines in the Northern Territory. What about
I'll respond to that.
Will there be any carbon credits on Beetaloo Basin?
Well, it is the same answer. It is the same answer, that the facilities are identified. It is the same mechanism that Tony Abbot put in place or referenced and implemented by the coalition government, supported, if I may say, by the BCA and AIG. And the answer to your question is the same as the answer on coal. We're not going to make people internationally uncompetitive. We understand that, and our policy reflects that.
Your own statement says that you will listen and act on Pacific Island warnings about the existential threat of climate change. If they say or warn that they do not want any fossil fuel projects or new fossil fuel projects, will you listen and act?
Oh, look, I've had that put to me when I was Climate Minister. So it's quite a while ago, and we've made clear what our policy is. Our policy is consistent with the UN framework to reduce emissions in Australia. It is not to change our position in relation to those industries, that those industries will still be subject to the usual environmental approvals, and the Labor government will deal with them in the same way.
And what you're saying about not making them...
You go first.
What you're making...
Do you want to... Sarah first, and then I'll come to you. Sorry.
I understand what you're saying about making sure that these companies are not uncompetitive against the international partners. That doesn't necessarily mean they won't be charged after they go.
No. I think we've made that clear. Obviously, the Clean Energy Regulator will work with the facility, as the BCA and others want them to, and there are a range of ways in which they can discharge their obligations, and that might include technology, and it might include carbon credits. We've been clear about that. And the modelling, if you're asking a question about the modelling, which I think you asked in Darwin, it's the same as the government modelling, which I think is $24 a tonne. Would you like?